Hey everyone, this is Nitro. With the new focus banner, which gave people Ultimuller, Bernhard, or Bozo, I thought that I should do a video on how to build Bernhard, if you're lucky enough to get him. And Bernhard is a very interesting character. Let me just say this up front. In PvE, he is not a damage dealer that one-shots targets. Okay? That is not his role. Instead, Bernhardt is more like a flexible character who can be used in a wide variety of ways. So, let's go over his talent first, then we'll talk about his classes, and with the classes, we'll talk about all his skills. And it's the skills that make him such a flexible character that he can be used in a wide variety of ways. So first, his talent. First, when he's entering battle, he increases the damage percentage by a certain amount. Okay? So he does get increased damage in that sense, right? However, this damage increase is, to be honest, lower than the damage increase that, let's say, heroes like Elwyn, who is a pure damage dealer, would get. So, Bernhardt's damage increase at, I believe at 3 stars, it's a damage increase of 10%, okay? At 4 stars, which I currently have him at, it's 13%. At 5 stars, it goes up to 16% damage increase, and then at 6 stars, it's a 20% damage increase, okay? In addition to this, there's a second effect about Bernhard, and that's all enemies within 2 blocks of him have their attack and defense decreased by a certain percentage. So at 3 stars, that's a 5% decrease. At 4 stars, it goes up to 8%. 5 stars is 10%, and then 6 stars is a 15% damage, 15% attack and defense decrease to all enemies. So actually, this debuff really helps in decreasing the amount of damage enemies can do to you, and as well as increasing the amount of damage you deal. Excuse me. So yeah, it's a great effect against, let's say, dragons, because they have very high attack and defense values. So although it's subtle, this aura of his, if you will actually allow all your other characters to do increased damage. So that's one thing that makes Bernhard great. Now, let's talk about his classes first. So, Bernhard, what you normally do with Bernhard is, I find, it's his Gladiator class absolutely must be unlocked. The Shield Bash ability is so versatile that it's an incredibly useful PvE skill. Okay? Gladiator, the Shield Bash, for example, has great utility against the Anarchies, any Anarchy, especially the high level ones, because by using Shield Bash on the Anarchy, it knocks them out of the fight for 1 turn, and then you can attack it without taking any retaliation damage. So a great combo for killing off Anarchies is have Bernhard Shield Bash them, and then once the Anarchy is stunned, attack them multiple times with Leon. So Leon attacks, uses again, attacks a second time. You're not taking any damage, and you've hit Anarchy multiple times. And this ability, and every Anarchy does have a turn where, at least 1 turn, where they can be affected by Shield Bash. So yeah, it's just one of the greatest skills, knocking an enemy out. Okay. Next, other than Shield Bash though, now, Brave class is, to be honest, not exactly required for Bernhard. It's great to have it simply because the Brave class, of course, gives additional stats. Plus 15 attack, plus 16 defense, plus 90 hit points. It's pretty nice stats to get, but it's not exactly required. I would recommend it if you use a Bernhard, but if you don't have the runestones, you can avoid getting the Brave class. I just mentioned it because the Brave class does unlock the Parry skill, which is incredibly useful because it only costs 1 point, and it allows Bernhard to take a physical attack for nearby units. So in many ways, this Parry skill allows Bernhard to act as like a mini tank. A tank that can only guard 1 range, but it only costs 1 point. So, incredibly useful skill, Parry. So that's another great skill that Bernhard has access to. Shield Bash and Parry. Next, is his two main classes, which is Swordsman and Emperor. Emperor is an absolute must, in my opinion, for Bernhard, because Emperor is where he gets his faction buff. If you're using Bernhard, you're basically playing the Empire. And if you play Empire, Bernhard is definitely your main faction buffer. So, yeah. So, basically, my personal opinion is, as soon as you get Bernhard, if you plan on using him, you should go up the Swordsman and Emperor line and get these two classes unlocked. But you should also commit one runestone to get the Gladiator class. Because the Gladiator class, the Shield Bash is just so useful. So, that's it. Last but not least, I guess there's a General class, and the General class gives Bernhard an actual, I guess, defense skill. So it's the true tank skill. The reason I have not unlocked it myself is because this tank skill, Iron Fist, takes 2 costs in terms of skills. Given you're using Bernhard, you probably want to use Imperial Power for 1 skill, and then either Shield Bash or Hegemony for his 2nd skill. So that doesn't really leave you any points to use Iron Fist, which is why I've never unlocked it. If you want Bernhard to be a mini tank, use Parry. That's my opinion. And finally, General class does give some nice stats. You see here, 80 hit points, 7 attack. But at the end of the day, it's not really worth the runestone, especially when there's so many other more important classes you have to unlock for other characters. So, this is a nice to have, but it's not required at all. I do think Gladiator, Swordsman, and Emperor are the must-have ones, and then Brave is kind of optional. If you want a more usable Bernhard, by all means, get Brave. Otherwise, you can wait till later. So that's Bernhard's classes. Now, let's talk about his skills then, and why they're all so great. It's so hard to design a Bernhard because of his skills, okay? So my most common use of Bernhard is this setup, which is Imperial Power for the faction buff. And as a quick note, Bernhard's faction buff is one of the better ones, because in addition to being the regular faction buff, he has an extra effect where all Empire units do an additional 20% damage when battling against units they have a class advantage over. So, for example, if Bernhard had the faction buff and he attacks a Lancer, he does an additional 20% damage. If you have, if Cavalry attack infantry, they do 20% additional damage. It adds damage, which is a great faction buff to have. Okay? So, and then Shield Bash I've already talked about. Incredibly important, incredibly useful for fighting against the Anikies. So that's Shield Bash. And then I like to use Parry for his 3rd skill because it gives Bernhard versatility in becoming a mini tank. I have another video uploaded of me doing Guild Wars battles where Bernhard is acting as my tank. So I will have the link in the video description so you can take a look at that video to see just how Bernhard works as a tank in Guild Wars. But yeah, other than Parry, the other great skill for him is Rupture. And Rupture adds, after your attack, you will add additional fixed damage to the enemy after the battle. And it deals 2 times the hero's attack value in fixed damage. So if you have a Bernhard with high attack, this fixed damage can add quite a bit of damage to the enemy as well. So that's another great skill to have. In addition to these 2, Sword Dance is really a PvP focused skill because it's an AoE attack skill, right? AoE attacks aren't that great for fighting in PvE, where the enemies usually have very high hit points. But in PvP, where the enemies don't have as much hit points, they have the same amount as you, Sword Dance is actually quite amazing. And in addition, it makes it so that enemies can't be healed. So, yeah, Sword Dance is just a great PvP focused skill. Next, we'll talk and as a quick note, Sword Dance does combine with Rupture. So if you do a Sword Dance, all the enemies who are hit by the Sword Dance will also be affected by Rupture, which makes it a great combo. Sword Dance plus Rupture, plus, let's say, the faction buff. That is usually his PvP setup. So, like this. Faction buff, Sword Dance, Rupture. That's the PvP setup for Bernhard. And the last really amazing skill for Bernhard is actually Hegemony. And this Hegemony skill is actually kind of inaccurate. It says, when attacked, dispel one enemy buff, and it decreases enemy defense by 20%, lasts 1 turn. When it says when attacked, it actually means if you're attacking as well as when your Bernhard is attacked. So in both cases, it will dispel an enemy buff and decrease the enemy defense by 20%. This is an amazing skill for dragons, especially the Thunder Dragon, because it can remove the enemy buffs when you attack or when you're getting attacked. So it's just an incredibly useful skill. Hard to fit in because, as I said, you know, for example, this you might want Imperial Power, Shield Bash, and Parry rather than Hegemony in the 3rd skill slot. But it is a great skill to have if you can equip it. So that is Bernhard's skills. You can see a lot of different skill options, and it's very hard to choose which one to use for him. So that is Bernhard's setup, and let's talk about Bernhard's soldiers. So Bernhard is actually quite flexible. You usually choose between, there's actually 3 units which are very good for him. The first one is Lava Titans. If you want to use Bernhard as a tank, sometimes you'll switch him to Lava Titans instead of using infantry, right? Now, the next soldier that's very useful for him, and in fact is my recommended soldier for Bernhard in most cases, is Dark Guards. Dark Guards are they're more of an offensive-oriented soldier, because when attacking, after battle, they deal damage equal to 10% of their max hit points to the enemy. So this is another fixed damage part that Bernhard does. Yeah, Bernhard just has a lot of fixed damage. There's Rupture, right? There's his soldiers who do fixed damage, and so that's why these soldiers really fit. These Dark Guards really work for Bernhard. In addition, though, after you attack, right, at the end of the battle, they will restore 20% of their soldier hit points. So they self-heal as well. So that just makes these Dark Guards very, very useful for Bernhard. If you don't have Dark Guards unlocked, of course you can use his Guardian Infantry, which he unlocks via the Brave class, by the way. So that is actually another reason to get Brave. But yeah, if you don't have, generally speaking, Bernhard should be either using Dark Guards or Lava Titans. Those are his 2 best units. Both are from the training ground. His actual units that he unlocks, not particularly useful for him. Alright, so we've talked about his soldiers now, and I guess let's now talk about his equipment. And I'm going to actually move my equipment back to him, because for some reason he is currently naked. The Emperor has no clothes. Alright, actually, I know why he was unequipped. It was because I was using Emmerich for Arena, trying to unlock one of his bonds. So let's move his equipment back. This is by no means Bernhard's ideal equipment. But you can see that I don't use Bernhard with very upgraded equipment even. There's a level 50 Mithril Armor. There's a level 40 Anasis Helmet. There's a level 30 Speed Boots. And then his weapon, even his weapon is just level 40. It's an SSR, so it would be equivalent to, let's say, a level 50 Mithril Sword. But you can see I haven't really focused on Bernhard's equipment on the whole. And the reason is because the way I use Bernhard, he's not meant to one-shot targets, right? And because he's not meant to one-shot targets, this equipment set is more meant for him to be versatile than it is for him to one-shot enemies. A level 40 Seal Guardian is enough because it gives him a good amount of damage. While not being amazing, it still gives him a good amount. Same thing for the Mithril Armor. It gives him enough hit points and enough defense to survive, to be a tank when he needs to be. But most of the time, if you're using Bernhard, you'll have an actual tank that is protecting him. And in addition, most of the time when Bernhard attacks, he's using Shield Bash, so he's not taking any damage. That's why I haven't upgraded his armor yet. The Anasis helmet, in fact, is not required for him at all. The only reason my Bernhard has an Anasis helmet is because I got 3 of them. So that's why he has a level 40 Aeneas helmet. I had already upgraded a level 50 Aeneas helmet, and then I picked up 3 more of them from farming dragons. So that's why he has a level 40 Aeneas helmet. There are people I know who use a level 20 carbon fiber helm on their Bernhardt, because he really shouldn't be taking magic attacks in general, and hence the helmet is just there to add hit points for him. So yeah, pretty versatile on the helmet. And then finally, I gave him speed boots because I find, personally speaking, I find infantry characters struggle to get into combat range of the enemy. I really don't like using a 3 range infantry class like Bernhard would normally be, so I give him speed boots for 4 movement. Just be aware, because I'm giving him speed boots, right? He's not getting plus attack from his accessory. So again, Bernhard's damage is further reduced. He has low attack, but it gives him more ability to move into attack range on enemies. So that's how I use Bernhard. Ideally, just a quick note, if you're going to use Bernhard as a versatility character like I am, you would instead give him, let's say, the Divine Boots. Because the Divine Boots give plus hit points and plus defense. So with plus additional defense, he would be more tanky. So that would be the option. But with that said, Divine Boots is an SSR item, and it's an accessory, which is hard to get. So Speed Boots works more than fine. If you were to focus on, let's say, an attack Bernhard, like I did for fighting against the Thunder Dragon, during that time, Thunder Dragon level 65, I had given him the Winged Shin Guards that is now on Leon. Because that gave plus 75 attack, right? So there's plus 75 attack, and there's 107 attack. Compared to Bernhard now, 75 more additional attack, and then 20 more attack here. So you're looking at 95 more attack on your Bernhard, which is very significant. Alright, so we've talked about, I guess, my current setup of equipment, and because Bernhard is a flex character not expected to one-shot targets, he can use practically anything. So I'm using speed boots and so on and so forth. Now, let's talk about a good equipment set for Bernhard then. And let's be honest, Bernhard can be very, very flexible in his equipment, because if you're not using him to one-shot targets, he can do whatever. But there is a very good equipment set for Bernhard, and this equipment set would be more focused on damage dealing and PvP, but I'll cover it because that's how Bernhard should be used in his final stages. So, I'm going to bring up, as usual, the spreadsheet with SSR gear. And here we are. Okay, so Bernhard, I mentioned earlier that Bernhard has a lot of fixed damage, right? Because of his skills, which is Rupture, Sword Dance, and even his soldiers, the Dark Guards. So, Bernhard in PvP is a fixed damage dealer. It sounds odd, but that's what he does. He moves into range, he uses Sword Dance to do an AoE strike on all enemies around him, and then he tries to apply as much fixed damage attacks as possible with that AoE strike. So, to that end, his best weapon is the very first one, right here. The Blood Sword Hunting. Because after you actively deal damage, there is a 50% chance to deal extra damage equal to 1 times attack to your enemy. So, that's Bernhard's best PvP weapon. If you're using PvE, you can give him a Seal Guardian for extra defense, like I do, because that's just it's just a versatile weapon in general. But otherwise, Blood Sword Hunting. As a quick note as well, it's kind of funny. He's incredibly versatile because you know how Bernhard Bernhard debuffs enemies, right? Well, if you manage to get I can't pronounce this at all. If you manage to get Thor's Hammer, what it does is it has a 100% chance to dispel 1 buff from the enemy before initiating combat. So if you do get this weapon, you can give it to Bernhard for fighting dragons as well. That way, with this and Hegemony, he will dispel 2 buffs from the enemy. And this weapon also works even in, let's say, PvP. because people faction buff, you can dispel 2 parts of the faction buff. Is it as good as Bloodsword Hunting? Probably not, but that is another build that Bernhard you can use Bernhard in. So as I said, Bernhard very, very versatile. It's very hard to determine what kind of absolute final equipment you want for him. But if you're PvE focused, I would say use Forest Hammer rather than Bloodsword Hunting. Next, let's talk about armors. And this is one of those things where Bernhard is again incredibly flexible. I will say right now, for all the melee characters, any of these 5 armors works for all of them. They're all great armors. That's why you can go with any of them and you can't go wrong. Because the skills, the effects just are helpful in every case. For example, the first one, Anasis Armor, increases received heal by 10%, right? Well, the Dark Guards self-heal. They could benefit from that 10% received heal. And the 10% defense will make Bernhard more tanky. Gaia's armor probably is not the best armor for him, to be fair, because that only applies when he is attacked, right? But it is a tanky armor, and if you use Bernhard as a tank, it can be useful. In addition, Aeolus's battle armor, right? When attacked with a range attack, 30% chance to reduce damage taken. Could be useful. Probably not the best armor for Bernhard because he shouldn't be taking ranged attacks, but it is useful. Now, the Bloodline Magic armor has, when attacked with a melee attack, 30% chance to reduce the damage taken by 30%. Again, not that useful for Bernhard because when you are attacking and so on, you normally try to use Shield Bash, and when you're attacked, it does make you more tanky. But again, not the best armor for Bernhard, but useful if you're using a tanky one. My personal opinion is the best armor for Bernhard is actually carbon fiber armor. And the reason for that is because it's the only armor that has a chance of increasing your attack. So when your hit points are above 50%, defense and magic defense are increased by 8%, so he's a bit tougher. But when hit point is below 50%, attack and skill are increased by 8%. So yeah, that's why, because it's the only armor that has a chance of increasing attack by a bit, I would say this is the best armor for Bernhard, oddly enough. But that, again, only really applies to PvP. For PvE, use any armor, it's fine. It doesn't really matter. So, let's talk about the helmet then. And helmet is the same thing. If you're talking about PvP, I would say the first one, carbon fiber helmet, which has the same effect as the carbon fiber armor, because it's the only helmet that can potentially increase attack. So that's what makes it good. If you don't have one, you know what? Use any armor. Like I am using right now, I'm using an Aces helmet. That's fine too. But overall, I would say carbon fiber armor is the best armor, best helmet for Bernhard. Let's go on to the next one. SSR accessories. So, in terms of accessories, I had already mentioned the Divine Boots because it gives plus hit points plus defense, which gives him the mobility and some more defense so that he's tanky. But if you're talking about PvP, I would say the best accessory would be an attack accessory, of course, because you need more attack for PvP. And in that sense, the best one is probably Forest Necklace. Because, again, it has a chance to apply fixed damage. When initiating combat, 50% chance to deal 1 times attack damage to the enemy after battle. So that again stacks with... It's another fixed damage attack that would work with Sword Dance. Otherwise, I would say Divine Boots. If you don't have Divine Boots, use Speed Boots. Alright, that pretty much covers all the equipment that Bernhard uses. So I'm just going to go back to the game and talk about his soldiers. And that will be the last thing that I talk about in this video. So, let's bring up the training grounds first. So, infantry training, this is pretty important to note. There's, I guess, a few parts to infantry training. The first one is that overrun tactics, right? Infantry damage dealt increases by 13% when attacking enemies with lower hit points. And then the second effect is emergency treatment. Damage taken by infantry is reduced when hit points is 80% or higher. So basically, both of the infantry training effects means that your soldiers or your infantry characters need to be high hit points in order for them to maximize the damage they deal and reduce the damage that they take. So to that end, really, Bernhardt, Shield Bash, very important, because as long as he's at high hit points, he's going to do more damage and take less damage. The other unit he uses is, of course, the Lancer unit, and there's really not much to say about Lava Titans, right? Lava Titans, if they just end their turn close to an enemy unit, the enemy will lose a certain amount of hit points after they take action. So Lava Titans are just a tanky unit where you're not attacking and you're relying on this skill to do damage to the enemy. Oh, they also work quite well with the Shield Bash again, because when shield bashing, you're not going to take any kind of retaliation damage, which keeps the Lava Titans healthy, and then they'll apply this debuff on the enemy. So yeah, those are the two main soldiers that Bernhardt should ever use, and that pretty much covers everything I wanted to say about Bernhardt. We've talked about his skills, his versatility, and the difference between using him in PvE and PvP, which is a fixed damage dealer. And on that note, I don't really have much else to say. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section below, and that might help me with changing my plans for Bernhardt, because I do know there are people who rely on Bernhardt with fixed damage to potentially kill things off, but my personal experience is Bernhardt is not a very great single target killer. If you wanted an actual single target killer, you'd be better off using, let's say, Elwyn. But yeah, that covers everything I wanted to say. So on that note, Nitro out.